Hello everybody, this is going to be a post-playthrough video covering the story of Slay the Princess, an interesting yet abstract game I discovered last October. This video will be mostly focused on presenting my interpretation of the story, so there will be some minor spoilers. However, in all honesty, this is not really the type of game that is particularly affected by spoilers, as it's not trying to surprise you with a lot of twists and turns, but rather it's more about looking at the same story from various perspectives. So with that in mind, let's start with a quick recap of the story before we dive any deeper. The game opens with the player approaching a remote cabin in the woods. The narrator tells the player that inside the cabin is a princess locked in the basement. You are then told that if she escapes the cabin, she will bring an end to the world, and that it is your job to go inside and slay her. Now, right away, it should be pretty obvious that something is very wrong here. There are quite a lot of questions that are left unanswered, and the narrator is purposely being evasive. But eventually, you'll exhaust all of your dialogue options and make your way towards the basement. Inside, you'll find a beautiful princess chained to a wall. But regardless of how you choose to interact with her, the end result will always involve violence, leading to the death of the player. The next chapter then immediately resets the player back to the beginning of the story. This time, however, you retain the memory of your past experience and are once again ordered to slay the princess. As you ready yourself for a second go, you notice that things appear drastically different from what you first remember. And despite the overall event still playing out in a very similar way, all the individual elements have been transformed into something surreal and almost nightmare-like in comparison to their former version. Finally, we reach the last chapter, where we are presented with a mirror that offers us a unique perspective of ourselves, before being led to an angelic entity who provides us with a cryptic conversation as well as a few final words before the game ends. So what is going on here? Well, my interpretation of the story is that somewhere out in the middle of nowhere is a lady being held captive by a group of individuals. Whether this person was taken out of an act of depravity or for the purpose of ransom is unclear. But regardless of the reason, it's pretty obvious that things did not go according to plan. Perhaps the ransom was simply not fulfilled, or maybe the location of their hideout had been compromised. Either way, the time has come to tie up loose ends. Hence, the player character is sent to carry out the deed. And this is somebody who's clearly not the brains of the operation, based on how little information he is given regarding the situation. My guess would be that he is just some grunt that does the group's dirty work. And on top of all that, he clearly is showing signs of internal struggle, where various parts of his brain are constantly arguing over whether they should help the captive or just follow orders. This is an individual under a lot of stress, and whose only motivation is the constant reminder that the world would end should the hostage escape. Which is of course a metaphor for the group being caught and punished for their crimes.
I'm talking about the end of everything as we know it. No more birds, no more trees, and perhaps most problematically of all, no more people. You have to put an end to her. She's not dangerous. She's just a princess. The danger comes if she gets out, which she will unless you do something about it. The more specifics you have, the harder it will be for you to do this very important job. She's a princess. People will listen to her because listening to her is in their nature, and when they do, everything will come crashing down.
So, with that as the main driving force, the player enters the basement, and this is where the story begins to branch out as the player gets to choose how they want to handle the situation. But no matter what you choose to do, whether that's to show sympathy or just carry out the murder in cold blood, it always ends in disaster for the player who is killed in the process. Now that's what I believe happened in Chapter 1. Let's talk about the crazy stuff that happened in Chapter 2. What's happening in Chapter 2 is that you are dying, and in your last moments your brain is replaying the events you had just gone through in the previous chapter. Only this time everything is grossly exaggerated. This is not an unusual behavior for somebody under a lot of pressure, especially because they are trying to justify committing something horrific. In fact, let's dive a little deeper and look at some examples from the game itself. In the Beast route, after failing to gain each other's trust, you decide to instead keep the princess locked away. The princess, sensing that there is no longer an easy way out, makes a desperate gamble. She severs her own hand and decides to fight you to the death like a cornered animal. The outcome is savage, and she manages to mortally wound you. and under such extreme circumstances, your mind no longer registers her as a lady, but rather as a beast fueled by the primal urge to survive at any cost. Now, alternatively, you could have instead gone with the tower route. Here you make an attempt to interrogate her for some answers, but after failing to get anything out of her, you ultimately feel intimidated and eventually let her get the upper hand on you. The fight is extremely one-sided, ending with her standing over you with the weight of her feet on your chest, and under those circumstances, your mind begins to perceive her as an indomitable figure that towers over you, and whose sheer presence is so intimidating that you feel like you have no real way to fight against her, as she continues to press her weight against your chest, causing so much pain it feels like knives are stabbing into your lungs, and only because of a lucky strike were you able to cut her Achilles heel and finish her off before your own demise. Now, of course, we could always take a complete 180 and go with the damsel route. Here, after being charmed by the princess, you decide to set her free. Although it does involve amputating her arm, you eventually manage to messily free her from her chains. However, shortly afterwards, you begin to have doubts of your plan. Thoughts of self-preservation start to win over your mind, and you begin to show signs of a change of heart. Seeing this threat, the princess uses the opportunity to steal the knife away from you and kill you before you have a chance to change your mind. In your near-death-like state, your brain reimagines the events playing out differently, showing you peacefully freeing her from her chains almost through magic while she repeatedly professes her love to you. Despite it being increasingly obvious that everything is a lie, you obsessively commit yourself into believing an idealized version of the story, before eventually dying from your wounds. So, at the end of the day, no matter what route you choose, the end result is always the same. Both you and the princess end up dying together. Which of course leads us to the final chapter, or rather the post-mortem. Here, the first thing you encounter is a mirror, a tool for self-reflection. You get a good look at yourself for the first time in the game. In the mirror, you see a dark silhouette trying his best to hide his face, clearly ashamed of what has happened. Afterwards, you eventually find your way towards an angelic aspect of the princess. Her form retains a lot of the features you remember from your previous encounter. However, her new calm demeanor suggests that she has found some semblance of peace and to a certain degree has forgiven the player, or at the very least has moved on from the tragedy. After one final exchange of words, all she simply asks in the end is that you remember her. Now, whether this is the actual afterlife or if it's just all in the player's head is up to you to decide. But before getting into my closing thoughts, I think this is a good time to take another look at the three principal actors in the story. That is, the princess, the player, and the narrator. Let's start with the princess. So, a princess is a standard archetype used to represent a person who possesses great influence but who is also a vulnerable bargaining chip, which in this case encapsulates the character pretty much perfectly, as clearly her kidnappers thought that there was some value in keeping her alive and locked away for a long period of time, while also being terrified of the consequences of her escaping. Now, whether this person was an actual princess or if this was just how the player perceives her in his mind is unimportant, as regardless of who she really is, her motivation remains unchanged. This is not a malicious supernatural monster or an evil being, but rather just somebody who has been trapped in a basement long enough to have reached the boiling point. She has ultimately decided to gamble everything on a daring escape plan, even if it meant she would die trying to escape. Either way, the suffering will end. So what about the player character? Well, the player character is an unnamed individual who has virtually no power to influence the final outcome of the story. As I had mentioned earlier, I believe the player is just a low-level grunt who was ordered to carry out the orders of his superiors. He is not a trained killer, nor is he a clever diplomat. Yet despite this humble role, he is still an interesting character. Throughout the story, we are open to his internal monologue, which takes the form of various voices you hear throughout the game. And while these tend to be one-way conversations, they do offer very conflicting opinions, which really reflects the complexity of his true nature. This is a person who is not confident in his abilities, he is not proud of what he must do, and he is not even sure if it is the right thing to do. In many ways, he really is just a pair of hands acting on behalf of others. Throughout the entire game, the only thing that's ever revealed about the player visually is his hands, which is portrayed as a pair of dynamic claws with scaly reptilian features. Even in the final act, when you do finally get to look at yourself in a mirror, all you see is an empty silhouette shrouded in the dark. This might just be a visual metaphor for how twisted the player has become at the end of all this, or maybe this is just how the player actually sees himself in the story. Perhaps in the afterlife he has taken the form of an empty ghost that's too ashamed to look past his mistakes. Lastly, of course, we have the narrator. The narrator in the story acts as an all-seeing third party, capable of both talking to the player as well as influencing the world itself. Originally, I had assumed the narrator was just simply a voice of reason in a player's head, one that speaks on behalf of the character's superiors. However, upon another look in the third act, I have revised my theory and I believe that the narrator is instead an unseen third character, one who is close enough to keep an eye on things but not willing to get himself directly involved. He may be a potential accomplice or just somebody there to make sure the job gets done. This would explain why certain events play out the way they do, like how the dagger magically finds its way to you despite being purposely left behind, or how the basement doors lock you in had you decided to make your way back upstairs before killing the princess. It would also explain why the narrator is finally silenced in the final act, where of course the player character has died and can no longer hear voices of the living. Now, obviously all of this is just pure speculation based on the routes I had discovered, and there are a lot more out there, so I wouldn't be surprised if other players come up with a different theory entirely. This is also the first time I've made a video like this where I go over the lore and story, so if you could, please post a comment below and let me know if you like these type of videos. But regardless of whether you agree or disagree with my theory, I do hope these ideas presented today offer you a new perspective in your own playthroughs. I personally find these type of games to be endlessly fascinating, as two people can look at the same story and have two completely different conclusions. So hats off to the developers for being bold enough to tell a story as dark and bittersweet as Slay the Princess. I know it can be a very difficult decision to design a game for a niche audience in 2023, but I'm glad you folks decided to do so anyway rather than chase trends. And with that, I would like to conclude this video. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy my content. Have a blessed day.